Legislation I came to the floor to talk about today, Mr. President, passed the Homeland Security Committee last week. It's to help make our synagogues, our churches, our mosques, and other nonprofit institutions safer. Sadly, we've seen a troubling pattern in recent years. Hate-fueled attacks at houses of worship and religious institutions, not just in our country, but around the world, are becoming more and more common. A couple of months ago, a shooting at a synagogue outside San Diego took the life of Lori Gilbert Kay, who heroically sacrificed herself to save her rabbi. Exactly 6 months to the day prior to that, the shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, claimed 11 lives, the worst act of anti-Semitic violence in U.S. history. Sometimes this hate is manifested in other ways: bomb threats at the Jewish Community Center in Columbus, Ohio, anti-Semitic graffiti sprayed on the Hebrew Union College walls in my hometown of Cincinnati, Ohio. Right after the attacks on the synagogue in Pittsburgh last year, I went to the Jewish Community Center in Youngstown, Ohio, only 60 miles away from Pittsburgh, to meet with Jewish community leaders. An attack on one is an attack on all. We must all stand up. In Youngstown that somber day, we talked about where we go from here to stop anti-Semitism and hatred. I asked them for input about what the federal government can do to help keep the Jewish community safe. Part of that input I got was we need more help on best practices on security and more resources to protect our community centers, our schools, our churches, our synagogues, our mosques. The resurgence of this anti-Semitism must be confronted and defeated with all the energy we can bring to bear. But sadly, it's not just related to the Jewish community, which has known it for over the centuries. Hate seldom stops at one religion or one country. Hundreds of Christians in Sri Lanka were massacred in churches and hotels on Easter Sunday. In New Zealand, the shooting at the mosque in Christchurch killed at least 49 people. We will never forget the 2015 tragic killings of African-American parishioners at the Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina, where I have visited and prayed, or the 2017 attacks on a Baptist church in Sutherland Springs, Texas. And while I have highlighted unconscionable mass murders, there are so many other examples of vandalism and harassment. We saw this in my home state of Ohio this February, where a man holding a gun smashed the windows of a mosque in Dayton while worshipers were praying inside. We saw it in Louisiana this April when 3 historically black churches were deliberately burned down within the same parish. This violence is senseless and contrary to our values as Americans. Our first obligation as Americans, and certainly as public officials, is to stand up and say, this must stop. Stop the hate. Not just partisan finger-pointing, but a single unified message. Targeted communities cannot stop it on their own. We must remind all of our fellow citizens that we are all made in the image of God, and the anti-Semitism, the hatred, and the violence is not acceptable in this country. Sadly, if these trends are any indication, we've also got to recognize these attacks are likely to continue. And I think Congress can and should do more to provide synagogues, mosques, churches, and other faith-based organizations with best practices and more resources to secure their facilities effectively. Based in part on the input I received in Youngstown that sad day, I've been the leading supporter of what's called the Nonprofit Security Grant Program. This grant program allows nonprofits, including synagogues and other faith-based organizations, to apply for funds they can use to access best practices, to secure their facilities, to train personnel. Some good news came out recently. Under the new Department of Homeland Security rules, nonprofits are now permitted to hire armed security personnel with these funds. That's something that I had promoted. I think it's a good idea because it's needed. Last year, I led a bipartisan letter with Senator Casey to push for a total of $60 million for the program nationwide. I'm happy to say that funding level was incorporated in the final Homeland Security Appropriations Bill. This year, I'm working with my colleagues to actually authorize this program, to be sure it's going to be there in the future, and to increase the amount of funding in the program to $75 million so that nonprofits outside of the largest urban areas, which are currently being served through the initial program, also have access to this funding. Unfortunately, in a lot of the instances I talked about earlier, it was not in major urban centers, so it's being spread well beyond our big cities. To support that effort, my colleague, Senator Gary Peters, and I have introduced bipartisan legislation called the Protecting Faith-Based and Nonprofit Organizations from Terrorism Act, to provide best practices and more funding for hardening vulnerable nonprofits and faith-based institutions, and for training resources for those congregations. The bill authorizes $75 million annually for the next 5 years. $50 million of that will be used by nonprofits located within high-risk urban areas, and the rest available again for nonprofits in other areas. I'm pleased to report that the Homeland Security Committee unanimously approved this bill last week, and I look forward to it coming to the floor, where I hope it can be passed on a bipartisan basis. While our bill is pending, I hope my colleagues in the Appropriations Committee will once again be receptive to the letter and spirit of our bill to make those resources available to urban and non-urban areas alike. I'll continue to work with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to ensure that the thousands of religious and other nonprofit institutions in Ohio and across our country are safe and welcoming places. I pray we'll see the day when such security grants are not necessary, because we'll abide by the admonition to love our neighbor as ourselves. But in the meantime, let's do what we can to give our communities the know-how, the resources, and the best practices so they can be safer and more secure. I yield back my time.